All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the last week of research methods. So this week we're going to be talking about ethics in research. So when we're thinking about ethics in research, we're thinking about two kind of categories of ethical concern. So the first is in clinical research, there's a potential for a direct emotional or psychological harm to the participants. So this could be in a study examining whether an intervention works, or a study that examines the presence of trauma in someone's history could cause some distress or re-traumatization or emotions that come up in that format. And then we're also thinking about general academic research. So here we're thinking about the potential for distrust in science and misinformation. And as we'll talk about throughout this presentation, ethical breaches have long-lasting implications, sometimes that we can't foresee. So first, talking about types of academic ethical violations. So there's three main categories. There's falsification, fabrication, and then plagiarism. So falsification is for example, having a data set and then kind of making up data, having fake data added to it. Fabrication would be coming up with data that doesn't actually exist. And we'll look at an example in a moment. And then plagiarism, of course, is taking someone else's words and using it as your own or not giving credit to the person. So more in depth here with plagiarism. So as we just said, it's using someone else's words, ideas, findings from research without properly attributing credit to the person that is the owner of those ideas or is the researcher. When we think about plagiarism, it's tricky because there's also this issue of self-plagiarism. So this could be, for example, submitting a duplicate paper that you did for one class and submitting it to a different class, submitting the same paper. It's also tricky because things like what's called or referred to as well-known facts do not need to be cited. So this requires kind of a judgment call of what is a well-known fact. So it requires us to really think about what kind of audience is going to read our paper and what would be something that they might know versus something that they might not know as common knowledge. And a general good rule of thumb is if you're in doubt about whether something is common knowledge, just give it a citation, just cite it from the source that you found the information. So in terms of fabricating data, as we just talked about, there is an example in the Baines textbook of a researcher named Deirdre Staple. And this researcher had fabricated research articles based on data that was never collected. So this person did not actually do any research and had basically created this data. And then from that data, there was fabricated findings, and the findings were published numerous times in prestigious journal articles. One of them was Science. And the long-term consequences included skepticism of science and scientific practices. And then for the students that were studying under this researcher who were working on their own research, they may have taken pieces of that data set or asked similar research questions, and they were using that information to reach their own academic markers, so working on their dissertation. And so it brought into question the validity or utility of if they could actually use that information for their own projects. Unfortunately, the rate of retraction, which is when a journal removes research from their record and from their publications, has increased significantly in recent years. So when we think about unintended consequences of ethical breaches in academic research, some things that we might think about are, especially medical research, delays in important breakthroughs. So delaying a cure for a serious illness because someone was spending time doing research that was not valid, that was not legit research. We think about misinformation. So, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a study that was conducted in Europe that was not well conducted. It was a not well run study that showed a cure, was what the researcher had said, of COVID-19 from hydroxychloroquine. And from that information, there was a couple that actually died when they consumed a form of hydroxychloroquine that was in, I think it was like a aquarium cleaner that they had in their house. And so the effect of that misinformation actually led to a death and some serious medical implications for those individuals. And then we can also think about if a researcher is working at an academic institution, a university, they're taking up space and a position in a research setting where somebody else who's more qualified and who's doing legit research could be using that space, that time, and those resources. So in response to this, the American Psychological Association developed some ethical core principles. And so these basic principles are kind of aspirational. We strive for them. And these are beneficence and non-malfeasance, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. And then more specifically, there are ethical guidelines. So it's required that people conducting research follow these guidelines. And these include, this is not an exhaustive list, but they include informed consent, confidentiality, minimal risk, deception, voluntary participation, and debriefing. And for more details on these, you can click that link below at the American Psychological Association.org/ethics code. So let's talk a little bit about informed consent. So this is a big area, it's a big term. So informed consent needs to include the following things. It has to include the purpose of the research, how long the research is going to take, all of the procedures that's involved in the research for the participant, the right to decline or withdraw once the person has engaged in the research as a participant. So at any time, they need to be able to step away and withdraw their information. They have to be informed of the consequences of denying or withdrawing their information. So we can think, for example, if someone is receiving treatment for PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, if they withdraw early from a study examining an intervention for PTSD, then they might not get that treatment that they were told that they could benefit from. They also have to be informed of foreseeable factors that may influence willingness to participate, such as potential for risks, discomfort, adverse side effects. They need to be informed of the prospective research benefits. So why is this research important? What are we hoping to get from it? What is society hoping to get from this research? They have to be informed of the limits of confidentiality, so how their information is going to be maintained, the incentives for participation, who to contact with any questions regarding the research. And there are additional components of informed consent when research involves an intervention. And so the APA website provides more information about that. So first, getting into confidentiality. So it's important that any identifying information about a participant is de-identified. So a person might be assigned a code, like a list of numbers, and that's their participant number rather than a first and last name. Other identifying information could be a date of birth, a place of birth, an address, a telephone number. And none of this information can be published in the research paper. There is an interesting case in 1977 called Doe v. Roe, and that had to do with confidentiality. And the New York Supreme Court had looked at this case where a psychiatrist couple, so it was a husband and wife, had published a book that contained identifying client information that they had gathered over several years of doing psychoanalysis with the client, who they referred to as Doe. The client, as a result, had faced consequences because people in her personal life had read this book and were able to gather enough information from what was provided to make a connection that it was talking about her, this woman. And this included she was ostracized socially, and her job was also being threatened by the information that was in the book. And so Doe had sued Roe for damages based on the hardships that she faced from this information being published. And Roe at the time had argued that the book had scientific importance, but the New York Supreme Court disagreed, and they did order for Roe to pay damages for medical expenses and lost income. So this is an example of when a court, in this case, the New York Supreme Court, had kind of weighed in on issues of confidentiality and whether confidentiality in this case outweighed, whether the benefits of the research or the publication had outweighed the importance of keeping this person's information de-identified and confidential. And next we have minimal risk. So a researcher needs to carefully analyze any potential risks that could come up from the research and then make a plan to mitigate the potential for harm. And as we talked about earlier, risks can include things like distress or re-traumatization. Deception. So there's an entire section in the ethics code related to deception, but deception in general it's not recommended to be used. It should generally be avoided unless it's determined that the scientific value of the research outweighs the risks and alternative methods are not feasible. So if it's the only way to answer the research question. That said, deception should not be used in situations where there's a risk of emotional or psychological harm. So, for example, we can think of the Milgram experiment that you all had watched, that talk by Zimbardo, where participants believed that they were actually causing harm to someone that was the learner by shocking them, by initiating electric shocks to the person. And there was use of deception in that study because the whole purpose of the study was to figure out if people would do unethical things if someone in authority told them to do it. And so those individuals had to live with this, this knowledge about themselves that they would engage in that behavior, which is harmful emotionally. And then last, psychologists must disclose and debrief the use of deception as soon as possible, and then allow participants to remove their information from the study if they choose to do so. The next is voluntary participation. So participation must be voluntary. It has to be without coercion, without exploitation or manipulation. This includes issues such as not avoiding offering large reimbursements or incentives for participation, and that participants know the limitations of any possible interventions or treatments that they receive. And then debriefing. So this involves providing prompt education to the participants regarding the purpose of the study, the procedures, and then the results of the study too. It also involves taking reasonable steps to avoid and address harm if harm occurs to a participant as a result of the research. So for example, a researcher might refer someone to psychotherapy. So how do institutions ensure that these guidelines are followed? So every institution, every state, every university has what's called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And this is basically a committee. It's a group of people that are non-biased, so they're not involved in any of the research. They don't have a stake in the game, so to speak. And they review the study purpose, the procedures, they assess potential ethical violations, and then they only provide approval for the research when it's determined that it is ethical. And so they have to determine that the researcher has mitigated any potential harm to the participants and that there's no exploitation happening. They also determine if there is a degree of potential risk that the benefit of the research outweighs that risk. And this kind of review is intensive. It requires full disclosure of all methods. It really requires a lot of kind of trying to foresee potential risks that could happen, and then including those any documents regarding informed consent in the raw research materials, so interviews, informed consent forms, that kind of thing. And then another kind of avenue of a way that we can help mitigate this in the field is that psychologists and other academic professionals are required ethically to report if they're aware of any breaches to ethics in research. So if they're aware that another professor is conducting unethical research, they're required to confront the person, and if that's not effective, to then file a complaint with a licensing board or with an ethics board. So the chapter talks about another kind of consideration when we think about ethics in research, and this has to do with conducting cross-cultural research, which is becoming more prevalent. And one of the things that's important that we keep in mind is this idea of ethical imperialism. So this is when a dominant culture attempts to impose their culture's ideas about ethics onto someone from another culture. This would be assuming if we were to conduct research in Haiti, that our values about what's ethical are the same as the folks that live in Haiti, the participants that we're working with, and we can't make those assumptions. It's important to consider that really there's no way to entirely understand individuals from different cultures and their viewpoints because we plainly we didn't grow up in the same culture. Another thing that we need to consider is that non-English speaking or English as a second language individuals may not understand things like informed consent. They might not understand the language that's used on certain forms that they fill out when they're providing that consent. And so it's very important to assess for that and make sure to mitigate some of that potential for misunderstanding. And then there's this other kind of last issue is whether the findings of cross-cultural research are generalizable to other cultures. And if the findings of the research are even applicable to the culture that was studied. So again, this idea of are we imposing kind of our Western view on the research question even on this other culture that we're trying to study. So we think kind of an example here, there was a video that was posted to this week regarding the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which is honestly really awful, an abomination. And there was a lot of ethical standards that were violated here. So thinking about this example, which ethical standards specifically were violated? And what do you think are kind of the lasting impacts that resulted from those ethical violations? So to name a few here, so informed consent was absolutely violated. The participants were not made aware of the purpose of the study. There were serious problems with the participants' ability to understand the forms that they were signing and the paperwork that they were provided. Many were had not gone to school, didn't know how to read or write, and so they would not know how to read the paperwork, and there wasn't really any explanation about what they were signing up for. Another issue is voluntariness. So whether participants felt that they needed to be involved in the treatment or in the study because they thought they might get treatment for what was known as being a lethal diagnosis. They were infected with syphilis. And so they believed that they were kind of in good hands. They were working with medical professionals that would provide them with treatment if that treatment were available. And in fact, they were not provided with that treatment. And then, of course, they were incentivized because these individuals were impoverished. They didn't have the financial or socioeconomic means to seek treatment in another capacity. And so the question is, was their participation really voluntary? And really, this violated all of the aspirational ethical core principles of respect, non-malfeasance, justice. I mean, really, it violated all of them. So what were the consequences here with this this awful experiment that was conducted on these people? One of the major consequences was that minority and underprivileged groups were led to distrust the scientific community, the medical community that exploited them in the past, rightfully so. And a major example of this in recent years is with the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccination hesitancy. And there's a lot of information about that, a lot of advocacy that was done around um, trying to ease people's minds around vaccinations. And at the same time, the concerns and the hesitancy was valid, given this history. All right, so that is it. So remember to complete the quiz and submit the final introduction section. And that's all. So congratulations on completing Sci 349. Um, I'm sure that you will look back on this with joy and all of the things that you learned. So it's been a pleasure. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.